Welcome to the Jack the Ripper question and answer. I asked you, the viewers, to send me your questions and I received loads of really good ones. Unfortunately, as I said at the outset, as so many were submitted, I can only answer the most popular ones, the ones with the most likes. I won't be able to answer some of your excellent questions this time, but don't worry, I'll be holding more question and answer sessions in the future, and hopefully I'll answer them then. Thank you everyone for sending in your questions and liking the ones that were your favourites, because without your input I wouldn't be able to make this film. So without further ado, from the House of Lechmere and Edward Stow, I'm going to get right into your questions about Jack the Ripper, the Whitechapel murders and the Thames torso murders. Thank you very much. We'll come to the first question from someone called Dave Smith. It's a very interesting question. What do you think the facial mutilations on Catherine Eddowes meant? This relates to the murder of Catherine Eddowes at Mitre Square at around 1:45 in the morning of Sunday, the 30th of September 1888. She was the third of the so-called canonical Jack the Ripper murders and the second murder that night. This was the so-called double event, the previous murder being that of Elizabeth Stride about 45 minutes earlier on. Elizabeth Stride only, if I can use the word only about a knife murder, had her throat cut. There was no ripping, no abdominal mutilations. The usual presumption is that her attacker was disturbed and went to look for another victim, presumably to sate his unsatisfied bloodlust. Unfortunately, that other victim that he found was Catherine Eddowes, and her body was mutilated in the most atavistic and brutal manner, the worst case so far. I say all this to give context to the question. Besides the abdominal mutilations, which had similarities to those inflicted upon Annie Chapman on the 8th of September 1888, Catherine Eddowes also had cuts to her face, as mentioned in the question. I will start by reading the post-mortem report of the City of London police surgeon, Dr. Frederick Gordon-Brown, with respect to those facial injuries. The face was very much mutilated. There was a cut about 1/4 inch through the lower left eyelid, dividing the structures completely through. The upper eyelid on that side, there was a scratch through the skin on the left upper eyelid near the angle of the nose. The right eyelid was cut through to about 1/2 inch. There was a deep cut over the bridge of the nose, extending from the left border of the nasal bone down near the angle of the jaw on the right side of the cheek. This cut went into the bone and divided all the structures of the cheek except the mucous membrane of the mouth. The tip of the nose was quite detached by an oblique cut from the bottom of the nasal bone to where the wings of the nose join on the face. A cut from this divided the upper lip and extended through the substance of the gum over the right upper lateral incisor tooth. About 1/2 inch from the top of the nose was another oblique cut. There was a cut on the right angle of the mouth, as if the cut of a point of a knife. The cut extended to 1.5 inches parallel with the lower lip. There was on each side of the cheek a cut which peeled up the skin, forming a triangular flap about 1/2 inch, 1.5 inches. And on the left cheek there were 2 abrasions of the epithelium under the left ear. When he examined the body on situ at Mitre Square, shortly after it had been discovered, Dr. Brown had also noted that the lobe and auricle of the right ear was cut obliquely through. I'm not going to show a photograph of these mutilations, but we'll link to the Wikipedia entry for Catherine Eddowes in the video description underneath for anyone who wishes to see, as the relevant pictures can be found there. There is, however, a sketch held at the London Hospital Museum, which used to be in the crypt of St Philip's Church, which is behind the hospital. Rather disgracefully, that has recently closed, but I'll use this image for reference, as it was used at the inquest into Catherine Eddowes' death, so presumably it's accurate. There are suggestions that the inverted V-shaped cuts on the cheeks are either Masonic references, being perhaps representations of a Mason's square and compasses, for those who favour a Masonic conspiracy solution, or if you put the inverted V's together it makes an M, and it is a reference to Maybrick, for those who think that either James or Michael Maybrick were responsible. However, if the culprit had intended to carve a square and compasses, then why not do that instead of doing two inverted V's? Similarly, if Maybrick intended to carve an M, why not carve an M? The Maybrick diary, which in my opinion is a ridiculous forgery, had this to say: her nose annoyed me, so I cut it off. Had a go at her eyes. Left my mark. Could not get the bitch's head off. Left my mark is supposedly a reference to the two V's making an M, but if so, it's incredibly vague. There are probably still other suggestions for a definitive purpose behind the facial mutilations. For example, that she knew her attacker and that is why he paid particular attention to her face. That's a common suggestion when facial injuries are made, but I can't see the relevance in that. The culprit had limited time, perhaps 5 minutes at most. It was a very dark night in a very dark corner of Mitre Square. After killing the victim, he engaged in extensive facial and bodily mutilations. She was disemboweled, her intestines were thrown over her shoulder, her organs, such as her left kidney with the renal artery cut through, and her womb were removed and were missing from her body. Alongside this, did the attacker also bend over and make detailed inscriptions on her face? Or were they just almost random slashings? I've seen it suggested that the cheek cuts were the result of one downward stroke with a sharp-edged knife that also took the end of her nose off with one same sweep, and that seems very likely to me. So I don't think there's any specific significance to the facial mutilations beyond it being an act of terror to shock and awe whoever found the body. I could have just said that, couldn't I, instead of going into this very long-winded answer, but I think it did deserve a long answer. The next question was from someone called Sinija. Hi Edward, I have a couple of questions about Lechmere and the Thames torso murders. 1. What is your evidence that the Lechmeres had a cat meat business? Do you think the Thames victims ended up as kitty chow? 2. Is it really true that Lechmere used to live at the site where the Pinchin Street torso was discovered? If so, that's mind-blowing and can't be coincidence. A little bit cheeky here. He's asking 2 questions in one, but we'll answer them both. Charles Lechmere's mother, then called Maria Fosdyke, is listed in the 1891 census as a horseflesh dealer for cat's meat. She is listed in the trade directories up to 1901 as a horseflesh dealer, and this incidentally puts her way above street hawkers of cat's meat in the hierarchy or pecking order of that industry. One of Charles Lechmere's sons was also listed in the 1901 census as a carman involved in the delivery of cat's meat. This son, who was called Thomas Allen Lechmere, went on to run a market stall in Broadway Market in Hackney, selling cat's meat, along with his son, his son was Charles Lechmere's grandson, and he was called Thomas Charles Lechmere, and they had this stall selling cat's meat at Broadway Market up to 1943, when they were both killed in the Bethnal Green tube disaster.
Ronald Lapham, 15. Anthony Lawson, 7. Patricia Lawson, 3. Maurice Lazarus, 42. Florence Lechmere, 66. Thomas Allen Lechmere, 66. Thomas Charles Lechmere, 43. Benjamin Leggett, 33. Rose Leggett, 31. Roy Leggett, 7. George Lewis, 9.
Thomas Charles Lechmere's children, that's his grandson, assisted in this business also, and one of whom is still alive. That, in other words, that's Charles Lechmere's great-grandson. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the body parts from the torso murders were included among the horseflesh sold to the local citizenry to feed their cats. That's the other little question that he snuck in there. The second proper question was, the answer to that is that Charles Lechmere lived in Pinchin Street in 1861 when it was called Thomas Street at number 13. This was when his mother was living with her first bigamous husband, Thomas Cross, who entered false information in that the census return of that year, seemingly to cover up for his bigamy. And that's the famous entry where Charles Lechmere was called Charles Cross. His mother moved back to Pinchin Street, number 23, from 1877 to 1884. Both of these addresses, the 13 Thomas Street, when it was called Thomas Street, and 23 Pinchin Street, are close to, but not under the arch or the railway viaduct under which the torso was found in 1889. However, when Charles Lechmere's mother conducted her second bigamous marriage and became Maria Fosdyke in 1872, she moved into 6 Splid Street with her new husband, Joseph Fosdyke, and lived there until 1877, when they both moved to that address in Pinchin Street, number 23 Pinchin Street, which I just mentioned. The reason I'm mentioning this about Splid's Terrace, number 6 Splid's Terrace, was that the bottom end of Splid's Terrace, including number 6, was demolished in the mid-1880s to create the viaduct under which the Pinchin Street torso was found. The Pinchin Street torso was under a railway viaduct that was only created in the 1880s, and that said, the very first house that she moved into with her second bigamous husband, Joseph Fosdyke, was demolished to create this new viaduct under which the Pinchin Street torso was found. Number 6, the house they lived in, was actually 2 or 3 arches down from the torso arch. So the footprint of the house where Lechmere's mother first lived with her second bigamous husband was about 30 feet from where the torso was found. Charles Lechmere's connections to the Pinchin Street are very strong and, in my opinion, slightly spooky. Right, the next question was from Searcher74. I asked for some hostile questions. I think this is probably a hostile question, or at least a semi-hostile question. Plain and simple. How are we to believe someone is capable of killing on his way to work? This is an objection I've seen raised before. It seems to imagine that Lechmere was working in a nice clean office in a starched white shirt, sitting placidly among his colleagues, perhaps sipping tea while going through the Morning Post. And that when he went to work, he was in employment mode, wearing work blinkers, thinking about his shift, his focus steadfastly on his working day, perhaps nervously hoping that he would not be late or commit any other transgression which might earn him a reprimand, which could jeopardise his employment and the welfare of his family. I've also seen the suggestion that he would have been worried about going to work potentially covered in blood. The most obvious retort to these objections is that if someone is capable of killing randomly multiple strangers, why would they not also be capable of doing it on their way to work? The overwhelming majority of this type of serial killer are psychopaths. Is work a sacrosanct activity for a murderous psychopath? I rather doubt it. But let's dive in and look at the specifics of this case. Firstly, the Pickford's depot at Broad Street Goods Station, which is where Lechmere worked as a carman or a cart delivery driver, was a dark, cavernous, subterranean location full of nooks and crannies. It was underneath the Broad Street passenger station. Neither exists now, by the way, but they were immediately to the west of Liverpool Street Station in East Central London. Broad Street handled a lot of meat, both for human and animal consumption. It came into London from around the country by train and was unloaded and carted to various wholesalers, restaurants and so forth, local butchers. If any blood was noticed in the dark, Lechmere had a ready excuse if someone saw any of the red stuff on him. Also, the depot stabled hundreds of horses, and there would have been water troughs and other facilities that would have enabled him to clean up. That is without the various troughs and water fountains between each crime scene and Broad Street. The issue of his being worried or concerned about the possibility of having visible bloodstains on his hands or clothing would have been much less of an issue for Lechmere than for virtually any other suspect you could mention. But it was an occupational hazard, if you like, for whoever perpetrated these crimes. Incidentally, most, if not all, of the Whitechapel murder victims showed signs that they had been strangled prior to having their throat cut, which would minimise blood flows, as this would cause the heart to stop beating, or at best only pump very weakly. Probably this was by design on the part of the killer. Lechmere said he had worked for Pickford's for over 20 years, and the goods station at Broad Street opened just over 20 years earlier in 1868. Pickford's had a haulage contract with the London and North Western Railway Company that ran Broad Street Station. Up until June 1888, when he moved to 22 Doveton Street, Charles Lechmere had lived at Mary Ann Street and finally at James Street. He would have had to walk to work, presumably in the early hours of the morning, every day for 20 years across these streets of Whitechapel, past the supposed prostitute hotspot around St Botolph's and onto Broad Street. That gave him more than ample time to understand the traffic on those streets, to know the locations where the prostitutes plied their trade, where they took their punters. He must have seen this going on in the back streets and known exactly how quiet and deserted those streets were at that time of the morning. Did he partake in that business himself? At the very least, there must have been banter with his workmates about encounters with the local prostitutes. If he was murderously inclined, his 20 years of walking to work through what was to become Jack the Ripper's killing fields would have been an excellent way of acquiring necessary knowledge about the area and about the people in that area. And he will have acted out his attacks in his head countless times before striking for the first time. He could have estimated how long he would likely have taken to do these crimes well before he even did them, which spots were relatively safe and which were too risky. And if stopped by the police, he had an excuse for being out and about on the streets at that hour. A serial killer is almost certainly going to be a psychopath and is not like a normal guy, believe it or not. He would not be bound by a normal person's concerns about getting to work. He had different priorities. His work schedule or his focus on work would have become a very poor second to his desire to kill. He cannot be judged against any normal yardstick. In short, killing on his way to work would not have been an issue for Lechmere. It was his most convenient time. The next question is from Michael W. Hi Edward, I think Lechmere is a very plausible suspect. However, I do wonder where Lechmere would have met Polly Nichols. If Bucks Row was very quiet, I think it's unlikely to have been there. So if Lechmere was JTR, do you think he would have deviated from his walk to work? And if so, where do you think he would have met her? It's my belief that Lechmere met Polly Nichols on Whitechapel Road, probably somewhere around the entrance to Court Street. It's always been my presumption, always, that when he was in the mood, he tended to go looking for potential victims on the main roads, be it Whitechapel Road, Whitechapel High Street, Aldgate High Street or Commercial Street. And they then took him to a suitable location. Suitable, that is, for the victim to conduct their business, but also suitably quiet for murder. These main roads are on Lechmere's axis to work and would only be a minor detour. He would then, in my opinion, return to the more direct back streets and quieter back streets to make his escape. The most popular questions are on next. Get commenting underneath. Do you agree with my answers? And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe. I think there's a link above here somewhere. And carry on watching. The top 3 questions follow now. Now this is the countdown to the last 3 questions, the 3 most popular questions. And the 3rd most popular question was from Susan71. It is, hello Edward, I'd like to ask about Lechmere's wife, the mother of his children. Do you have any information about her? Lechmere's wife was originally called Elizabeth Bostock. When Lechmere married her in 1870, she was living in Lower Gun Alley, which is close to Wapping High Street. Her father was called Thomas Bay Bostock, and he was a lighterman that worked on the River Thames. Lower Gun Alley or Wapping High Street are 100 yards, less than 100 yards from the River Thames. It's right on the riverside, on the Docklands area. Both Thomas Bay and Elizabeth were illiterate. They always signed their names on certificates with a cross. Elizabeth had 11 children with Charles Lechmere. 2 died in infancy, and interestingly, 1 was brought up by her mother-in-law, Charles Lechmere's mother. Elizabeth Lechmere, originally Bostock, died in hospital in Leytonstone in 1940, 20 years after Charles Lechmere, and they were buried in the same cemetery but at opposite ends. We've got 2 pictures of her, one almost certainly taken around the same time, possibly exactly at the same time as the picture we have of Charles Lechmere around 1910 perhaps, and the other when she's considerably older, probably not long before she died when she was 90. None of Elizabeth Lechmere's, originally Bostock's, great-grandchildren who would have known her in the mid to late 1930s and who I met when they were obviously elderly, none of them ever mentioned her or anything about her, or for that matter her husband Charles Lechmere, which might seem strange for someone who you might imagine she would have been the sort of venerable matriarch of the family in the late 1930s before she died. But I suspect she didn't have a very dominant personality. I'll draw attention to these details. Her illiteracy would have prevented her from reading any newspaper reports about the murders. And also her father's trade, working as a lighterman on the river, and Lechmere's courtship of her in the early 1870s around the Thames riverside would have given Lechmere access to the river and possibly knowledge of the tides, which would be useful for any torso murderer who dumped the body parts in the River Thames. And also, don't forget, quite a few of the body parts seem to have been dumped in the River Thames, where the River Thames flows through the East End. And now we come on to the second most popular question from David Janssens. Hi Edward, in one of the first videos, you mentioned you would discuss a lot of murders that might be by the hand of Jack the Ripper, many more than the 5. Of course, you have mentioned several other attacks in the period around the Ripper cases and the Torso murders, but do you think Lechmere can be linked to more murders than already previously discussed in your videos? I've mentioned in various different videos already, at least in passing, most of the murders I suspect he may have been guilty of, and will in due course cover all of them in greater detail. But briefly, to avoid ruining my future videos, I think it started with the murder of Harriet Boswell, which was known as the Great Coram Street murder in 1872, followed by the so-called Battersea Torso of 1873. There are a series of other murders which I will call the Bloomsbury murders in the late 1870s and early 1880s, and a couple of bodies were found in the Regent's Canal near Broadway Market in Hackney, which I referenced earlier on, to do with where they had a cat's meat business. But these bodies turned up in the canal in the 1890s, late 1890s, and there are also some other torsos in the later 1890s. Now, he may or may not have been responsible for all of these crimes, but as I said, I'll cover them all in detail in future films. In my opinion, the so-called Jack the Ripper murders were just an intermediate stage or phase in the middle of a much longer series of murders. In this respect, this would make Charles Lechmere similar perhaps to the Golden State Killer, or his real name was Joseph D'Angelo, who stopped killing and was only found or discovered by the police much later due to DNA evidence becoming available, and he was found guilty of crimes. D'Angelo was found guilty of crimes which had previously been subscribed to several different perpetrators. They thought they were unrelated crimes originally, and were variously known as the culprit was given sort of nicknames for these different crimes: the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, or the original Night Stalker, for example. These crimes, which are now all grouped under the name Golden State Killer, that's the sort of nickname given to D'Angelo, were committed between 1974, possibly earlier, and 1986, quite a long time scale. There are at least 13 murders, 51 rapes, and 120 burglaries. So he had different types of crime. He was caught many years later, as I said, in 2018, and his family never suspected him and thought he was a perfect father, which I just throw those extra details into the mix for a bit of extra flavour. And finally, we come to the most popular question of all, from someone called Thomas Ahern. Perhaps a slightly surprising topic, but maybe very interesting nevertheless. Do you believe Lechmere wrote the Dear Boss letter and or the From Hell letter? This issue is not in any way important to the case against Charles Lechmere, but nevertheless, let's go through these letters. The first is the so-called Dear Boss letter, received on Thursday the 27th of September 1888 by the Central News Agency and passed on to the Metropolitan Police on Saturday the 29th of September. It was written in red ink on 2 sides of 1 sheet of paper and was sent in an envelope. It read, Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. I'm down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them until I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear from me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope, ha ha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers, just for jolly. Wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha. This is the first ever mention of the name, the trade name, Jack the Ripper. When I was doing some research in the excellent archives held by Tower Hamlets in the old Mile End Old Town Vestry Hall on Bancroft Road and going through the newspaper and microfiche held there, I was struck by book adverts on the last pages of these old newspapers, many of which had the word Jack in the title. I think this was the inspiration behind that trade name. Notice that the letter said, I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear from me with my funny little games. And I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. The night after the police received the letter, and after a gap of over 3 weeks between the previous killing, Jack the Ripper, as we can now properly call him, did start again. In the early hours of the morning of Sunday the 30th of September, with the murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, the police did soon hear from him. He did get to work right away. The letter also said, the next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off. Remember that Dr. Brown had noted when he first examined Catherine Eddowes that the lobe and auricle of the right ear were cut obliquely through. This led the police to release the text of the Dear Boss letter to the press, and it was widely reproduced on Monday the 1st of October. The questioner of this question that I'm answering now, Thomas Ahern, doesn't mention the next piece of Jack the Ripper correspondence, nor known as the Saucy Jackie postcard, as it is known as a postcard because it was written on an unenveloped postcard. Handwriting and linguistic analysis suggests that the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard were written by the same person. Also, the Saucy Jackie postcard refers to the Dear Boss letter, so it seems to me that they should both be considered in my answer to this question. The postcard was also received by the Central News Agency on Monday, the 1st of October, the same day that the text of the first letter was printed in the newspapers. The text of this one is as follows. I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number one squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had not time to get ears off for the police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper. This is where the term double event was coined for the two murders of that night. If Dear Boss is genuine, then so is Saucy Jackie. And Saucy Jackie was almost certainly posted before the Dear Boss letter had been published, and it mentions the ears again. The police later insisted that it was the work of a journalist. In the 1930s, one journalist claimed another had concocted the first Jack the Ripper letter, but no one actually owned up to it, and I've never been convinced by this. Next, we have the From Hell letter, which was postmarked on the 15th of October 1888 and delivered on the 16th to 1 Tollet Street, the house of George Lusk, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, who had featured in the newspapers frequently just prior to this in trying to lead efforts of the local population to try and capture Jack the Ripper. His house and its door on the corner of Tollet Street and Ordinary Road is still there. The letter read as follows. From hell, Mr. Lusk, sir, I sent you half a kidney. I took it from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if only you wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk. The letter was drastically and I suspect deliberately misspelt, perhaps to mimic a regional dialect or accent. As I said, this seems to be a deliberate effort at disguise, or maybe it was some sort of impression, like putting on an odd or amusing voice. Or was it the killer's alter ego? The handwriting was different from the other 2 letters, but if disguised, that would be expected. The letter was in a box along with a piece of kidney, and we can see that the letter claimed it was the missing piece of kidney from the murder of Catherine Eddowes, which we've already discussed. The letter writer claimed to have eaten the other half. The kidney was examined by a number of doctors and policemen, and conflicting views were given as to whether it belonged to Catherine Eddowes. A Dr. Openshaw examined it at London Hospital and was of the opinion that it was half of a left kidney. Major Henry Smith, the acting commissioner of the City of London Police, later said that there was a section of renal artery attached to the piece of kidney that matched the piece that was still with the body. It seems to me that it's likely that the kidney was genuinely from Catherine Eddowes, and therefore the letter was genuinely from Jack the Ripper. What of Lechmere's handwriting? I attach an example of his signature and his entry from the 1911 census. Various people have noted similarities. I leave it to the viewer to decide if that is the case. I endeavour to adopt what I would say is a rational and orthodox criminological approach to this subject, looking, for example, for the overtly normal, quiet local guy as the most likely suspect, and examining his actions in forensic detail at the crime scene. I think the 5 so-called canonical murders were just a short phase in a much longer cycle, which has to be a more likely happenstance. However, a rational, sensible criminological approach is not traditional in Ripperology, not at all. But in many ways, I am a traditionalist in matters to do with Jack the Ripper. For example, I think the Goldston Street graffiti and these 3 letters were penned by the Ripper. They are part of the legend, the mythology, the tradition of the case, the very patina, the fibre of the mythos. No doubt that's why this was the most popular question that people voted for me to answer. Whether or not you believe these letters were genuinely connected to the culprit or not is, I think, tied to your natural inclination, your beliefs, rather than to any specific evidence. You may be inclined to believe that a journalist was responsible, or that the kidney was a medical student's prank. For me, the writing is too chilling, too creepy, too manic for a journalist to invent out of the blue, literally with no prior blueprint for such things. As with the positioning of the bodies, I think the intention was to shock and awe. And my gut feeling is that these 3 letters were all genuine and by Jack the Ripper. So that was another long answer to the most popular question. I hope you enjoyed that. There'll be more question and answer sessions on the House of Lechmere in the near future, so keep your ears open for when they take place, and if you subscribe, you'll find out soonest. Get your comments in below. Please like, share, and look out for my next film. Thank you very much.